Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Murtha. I'm the director of the China Studies program here at SAIS. And first thing I want to say is what we're experiencing right now is in Chinese, it's referred to as a maodun, a contradiction. So they have just switched classes on Wednesday afternoons, and they no longer end at 4:30, they end at 5. And yet we are starting at 5. So that's why we're starting a little bit late, and there may be some people trickling in, but I didn't want to wait any longer because it is my genuine pleasure to introduce to you Professor Ha Jiming. Professor Ha is a visiting professor at Darden Business School, the University of Virginia, and an independent director of the board of Lufax China. He was a senior fellow of the China Finance 40 Forum in 2018 and vice chairman and chief investment strategist of the Investment Strategy Group for Private Wealth Management within the Investment Management Division of Goldman Sachs Asia from 2010 to 2017, focusing on macroeconomic research in China. He joined Goldman Sachs in investment banking services as managing director in 2010. Prior to joining the firm, Professor Ha was chief economist at the China International Capital Corporation from 2004 to 2010. And before that, he was a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund from 1993 to 2004. Professor Ha worked at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority within the IMF from 2001 to 2003 and served as the IMF resident representative to Indonesia from 1999 to 2001, which must have been a fascinating time to be there. Professor Ha earned a PhD in economics from the University of Kansas and an MS and BS from one of my honorary alma maters, Fudan University in Shanghai. I have had the privilege of seeing Professor Ha's PowerPoint before all of you, and I can tell you that this promises to be an extraordinarily stimulating presentation and conversation to follow. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Ha Jiming.
Thank you, Andrew, for the detailed introduction. It's my honor to be invited to give a talk on China here in this forum. First of all, I have a very important announcement to make. I've been living in the US since May and didn't go anywhere else. So I'm not the one who came here last night from the airport, so don't worry. Even if I cough, and I wish I don't. Anyway, so these days, I think not a single day passes without China appearing in some kind of newspaper headlines. And everybody wants to know China. Everybody is talking about China, for better or for worse. And today, I wish to focus on 4 areas. I'm an economist by training, so I will focus my discussion on economics, although it may have to trespass a little bit to the area of international relations. But I'm certainly not a, epidemiologist. So, the situation, particularly at this moment in China, is quite fluid. But as economists, we do have to come up with some assessment of the short-term impact from the pandemic or epidemic, whatever you call it. But it's subject to a lot of uncertainty, but I will try my best. So these 4 sections here would include short-term policy and economic developments and U.S.-China trade relations, which is a topic that I focus with professors at Darden Business School. And we also discuss a bit about the long-term challenges and opportunities in China. So let me first start with the short term. Now, there are so many numbers here. I wish to just draw your attention to the comparison between 2018 and 19. And you can see many of these numbers suggest a marked deterioration or slowdown in the Chinese economy over those one-year period for obvious reasons, particularly the trade war with the US. But a high-frequency data seems to suggest that the economy somewhat bottomed up from the third quarter, particularly from October. October probably was the worst month last year. But going into November and particularly December, we see signs of some activities edging up, be it production, exports, even PPI, the producer price deflation, moderated from a decline of 1.6% in October to a decline of 0.5%. Recent data, which was just released after I finished the presentation, showed a virtually flat, a positive 0.1% change in PPI. So it looks like things were getting slightly better by December, which is good news. What are the causes behind the recovery? I think it's just policy stimulus. On the monetary front, we saw that the central bank cut interest rates and even the reserve requirement ratios quite a few times to stimulate the economy, to increase bank lending. As a result of that, money growth, M2, edged up. Bank lending didn't go up significantly, but the total social financing, which includes bank lending and other means of finances, like corporate bond, like the government lending, picked up noticeably. So the blue line, as you can see, is trending up. So monetary policy is very accommodating. Then on the fiscal front, the fiscal deficit increased significantly in the recent years, particularly last year. This chart that I showed here, the last bar, the highest bar, was still a projection. The actual figure just came out 2 days ago. It's not 3.2%. It's 4.9%. 4.9% fiscal deficit last year. Highest since 1952. It's a tremendous stimulus. That was at the central level. At the local level or provincial level, you can see these are the fiscal deficits recorded by provincial government. Shanghai, my hometown, used to have fiscal surplus for many years running. But last year, we got a deficit. And not to mention other states or other provinces. For your interest, this Hubei has a huge deficit, even last year. So local governments and central government stepped up fiscal efforts to try to stimulate the economy. However, the economy still grew only 6.1%. Only, I mean, many countries are dying to have a 5% growth. China, 6.1%, which is not slow, I have to say, if you believe the data. But, but the thing is, it's still 6%, 6.1%, right? Slowest since 1991. Why is that? Well, in the past, even in the peak of the financial crisis, 2008, when China stimulated the economy, growth picked up from 6% to very fast to high single digit. Because at that time, there was a huge pent-up demand on consumptions, particularly housing, automobiles, white goods, everything. So when there's a fiscal stimulus, people are trying to buy whatever they want or advocated by, subsidized by the government. So you can see that time the size of stimulus is bigger, and the pent-up demand was very strong. However, this time around, a lot of demands, have been satisfied already, and it's difficult to stimulate the economy as it did in the past. And more importantly, President Xi this time insisted that housing policy should not be relaxed for the prudency of long-term macroeconomic prudency. I think he's right. But the reality is, despite the stimulus from the central bank, from the Ministry of Finance, and growth was still 6.1%. Now, very unfortunately, the butt of recovery probably has already been nipped by the ongoing epidemic, what they call the coronavirus, yeah. And the name keeps changing. In China, the Chinese authority called NCP. Yesterday I heard the WHO is calling it COVID-19. COVID. It sounds like a cupboard. Very fishy name. But anyway, I think, I hope the numbers are not covered. But the thing is, this virus may cause China's economy to experience a sharp slowdown in the first quarter. There are many articles that I read from here. Chinese economists, policymakers are trying to pacify the public so the impact won't be so big. But if you think I tried to find a reference event to compare with. SARS of 17 years ago is probably a good reference to compare. I lived in Hong Kong at that time, SARS. I know that the situation was very, challenging, so to say the least. But this time around, I think the impact could be even bigger for a number of reasons. First, 2003 was the second year after China's WTO accession. There was massive capital inflow into China, and the Chinese exports were growing like 30% a year. And China enjoys huge so-called demographic dividends. Demographic dividends can be defined as a persistent rise in a country's share of working age population. As you can see, the first chart, China, in the first 30 years, from 1949 to 79, the government encouraged every family to produce at least 5 children. That's a baby boom year for China. But in the following 3 decades, Deng Xiaoping said, no, from now on, 1 child, please. So you see a very strange shape when you draw a chart of China's demographics. In the first 30 years, it's a left-sided triangle. Sorry, it's a right-sided triangle. You have a lot of babies, not many grown-ups, even fewer elderly. So you cannot grow your economy, right? Because child dependency ratio is too high. But 30 years later, you have olive-shaped demographics. Very few kids, even fewer elderly, but a large group of people are in the middle. And you can grow your economy very fast. Whatever you produce because of your cheap labor, no countries can compete. And people, guess what? They save. They save because only those who earn income can save. So you have a lot of people in the middle, automatically your country's savings rate is very high. So where are you going to put your savings? You put it in the bank, and then government will take it to invest in infrastructure. Every projects that you see in China benefited from high savings. So you grow your economy like crazy. And also, it will inflict an upward pressure on the country's exchange rate. Because your exports are so cheap, nobody can compete with you. And you tend to have trade surplus every year, accumulating foreign exchange reserves. Therefore, your currency will have to appreciate. And the third phenomena is those mid-aged people tend to buy apartments. Young people cannot buy, cannot afford. Old people don't want to buy. Only people in the middle. They buy apartments, not just 1, 2, 3, 4. They buy it as it's their checking account. You know, it's their savings. So housing prices skyrocketed. And that's why 2003 was a year China experienced SARS, but GDP growth eventually exceeded the previous year. GDP grew by 10% 2010, despite SARS, compared to 9.8% 2002. Anyway, so that's reason number one. Reason number two, China's debt level was very low, so the ammunition was ample for fiscal stimulus. So you have bigger room to maneuver on the policy side. Thirdly, demographics, I already touched upon that. And there was a huge pent-up demand. Car ownership, housing ownership was so low at that time. So in the aftermath of the epidemic, people rushed, they decided it's a time to buy more spacious apartments. We need to keep some distance from each other, right? And I want to own my own car. I don't want to go to subway. I don't want to, use public transportation. So that kind of demand drove up consumption. And finally, there's a nuanced factor behind it. China's economy now, the structure is quite different than 17 years ago, because China now, service-related consumption account for almost 50% of household consumption, compared to only, I think that time around, less than 30%. I mean, it's good, right? But it's a double-edged sword, because if your service-related consumption takes a very high proportion of your overall consumption, you are more vulnerable to the epidemic, because you don't want to go to movies, you don't want to travel, you don't want to even have your haircut, and it's irreversible. By irreversible, I mean if you missed this cycle for your haircut, you don't have to cut your hair twice next cycle, right? What's lost is lost. So it's different from goods consumption. So high percentage of service-related consumption probably this time will hurt the economy even worse than in the past. Anyway, so this is the current situation. So I here provided some estimates by market economists, like Goldman Sachs lowered China's GDP growth from the previous estimate of 5.9% to 5.5% for the year as a whole. And Bloomberg seemed to have the lowest print so far, 4.5%. And I think, because I don't want to project the GDP growth for the year as a whole, the situation is very fluid, but I think that for the first quarter, we may see near zero GDP growth in China, because you cannot think of a reason that GDP will grow faster. January last year, the Chinese New Year fell on February. So last year, January had more working days than this year. Now coming into February, we still have fewer working days than February last year, because people are not working now. God knows what will happen in March. So already for 2 months, we are working fewer days than last year. How can you grow your economy like 5%, 4%? It's very difficult. So the short-term outlook is quite challenging, I have to say. Now on trade. On trade, first I want to talk about, this is the material that I prepared. Part of that I prepared together with your neighbor next door, PIIE, last year. 2018, when I was with the China 40 Forum. Our counterpart here in the U.S. is PIIE. So Nick Lottie, all these people visit China. We also visit them. We produced a joint report, and some of the slides I'm showing here. One topic that we studied was why trade war? What's the background of trade war? Well, different people have different views. One hypothesis is the so-called Thucydides trap, when a growing power challenging a existing power, and particularly when China's economy is growing like 8, 9, 10%, the U.S. was experiencing lackluster growth. Over the past few decades, you can see China's growth rate, and more importantly, China's growth contribution to the world contribution far exceeded the U.S. So some people think this would make U.S. policymakers anxious, disconcerted, whatever you call it. Well, this is one hypothesis. So they think U.S. will do something to constrain China's growth. This view is highly subscribed by some people in China. Now, the second school of thought is China is becoming too aggressive, too assertive. China is now promoting Made in China 2025 through very intransparent means. And China is promoting Belt and Road Initiative, advocating a common destiny of humankind. What are you trying to do, right? So they think China forgot what Deng Xiaoping told them many years ago. Hide your ambition and bide your time. China now is less time biding. Therefore, U.S. will have to do something. That's the second thought. The third view is people just think China is not playing a fair game. There's no clear line between the Communist Party and the government, or between the government and the private sector. The government subsidizes corporates, even private companies, to expand overseas, to take advantage of the rule of law system in the Western democracy. So actually, as early as 2017, the US issued a report dubbing China a non-market economy. So as a result of that, US need to do something to make things reciprocal, to enhance reciprocity, right? Whatever you can do over there, I should be able to do over there. If not, you're not welcome to do it here. So that's another school of thought. The fourth bullet point here is people don't think it's just a trade war. It's just a tiny bit of a broader changing relationship between the two countries. So the NSS already made China a strategic rival. When countries like China, Russia, and Iran appear in a list, China usually go top of the list. In the past, at least Russia would go top of the list. Now China has switched position with the US. So that's, and one very popular view, I heard many people in China said, well, the US just want to find a scapegoat. The income discrepancy and wealth discrepancy is getting so wide. And the U.S. try to find someone to blame in order to accommodate the so-called hillbillies or the, the downtrodden, pariahs, whatever you call them. So this is, they think the U.S. as a whole definitely benefited from globalization. The thing that the people, those in the Rust Belt, don't like it because you screw up. You didn't establish a good wealth distribution mechanism. It's not China's fault. It's your fault. So some people feel very strongly about this. Anyway, if you ask me what is the true reason, I think it's a combination of all, right? It's just how much weight you want to attach to each of the factors. Anyway, now let's talk a bit about the trade imbalance issue. At the very beginning of the trade dispute, I think the U.S. administration emphasized the imbalanced trade relationship with China. If you look at the pie chart, yes, China accounts for 47% of U.S. overall trade deficit, which is bigger than with the next 8 countries combined. That is 42%. So if you ask a government official who are not economists by training, they will say, well, you have a problem, China. You run such a huge surplus against me. But China would say, wait a minute. You cannot judge trade imbalance based on bilateral trade relationship. My overall trade relationship with the rest of the world is balanced. Look at the line chart. China's current account surplus already went down from a peak of 10% in 2007 to now 0.4% as of 2018. The reason I have a huge bilateral trade surplus with you is because I'm a world factory. I import a lot from raw material producing countries, from intermediate goods producing countries, and I produce final products, sell it to you and Europe. Therefore, my trade has no problem. I'm balanced. Well, then people eventually agreed to disagree, and the trade war started. And economists would also tell you that tariff would not solve the problem because there is a very simple identity formula in Economics 101. Savings minus investment is exports minus imports. If your country's savings rate is high, you tend to have trade surplus, and vice versa. Countries like China, Japan, Germany have very high savings rate. Therefore, they have trade surplus, whereas US and UK, with very low savings rate, they tend to have trade deficit. So if you impose tariff, your overall deficit won't change. It's just your deficit against China will become your deficit against Vietnam, other countries. So why do you impose tariff? Why do you discriminate me? So people in China often make this argument. But again, this could not convince many government officials here. Therefore, we see the trade war. Now, a little bit of the events, evolution of events in the trade war. There are so many of the dates that, but I just want to highlight just 2 or 3 of them. Before September 1st last year, the U.S. imposed 25% tariff on $250 billion Chinese exports. On September 1st, a 15% tariff was imposed on additional 120 billion Chinese exports. And the U.S. was in a position to further increase tariff. By mid-December, I think, U.S. was supposed to impose another probably 15% tariff on additional $200 billion of your Chinese exports. However, going into December, the good news came. The U.S. said, we will cut that 15% tariff by half, and we will not impose the previously scheduled tariff for December, which will fall mainly on consumer goods, provided we reach a phase one agreement, including your increased purchase of $200 billion of goods in the next 2 years from us. So that's the trade, so-called phase one trade agreement. Now, I want to study why the two countries at last minute canceled the previously scheduled tariffs on $250 billion consumer goods. The answer is from this chart. If you just focus on the last two columns, column 4 shows the percentage of Chinese exports to the US in China's total exports of related products. For example, of China's overall cell phone exports, US accounted for 25%. For toys, 35%. Of furniture, 35%. Toys, 34%. So this is very significant proportion. And guess what? They are highly labor incentive sectors. If US do impose taxes, tariffs, China will have to suffer a lot. Similarly, the US will have to suffer as well. The third column shows the percentage of US imports from China in US total imports of relevant products, like cell phone. 82% of US cell phone imports are from China. So if US impose tariff on these $250 billion products in Walmart, in Best Buy, will all have to go up. So it's not surprising that the two sides eventually canceled this, because it will hurt both. Now, people in the market would like to know, when the US and China are fighting a trade war, who will benefit? Yeah. Who will benefit? Because they want to put their money there to invest in these countries, right? They don't care, I mean, a dollar is a dollar, right? Who cares how you make it, as long as it's legal? So people are trying to figure out opportunities from the trade war. Here I did the following study. I looked at the 8 biggest categories of Chinese exports to the US. And I find that out of the 8 product groups, China was number one in 7 of these 8 products. Then the question is, who are number 2 and number 3 or number 4? These countries are likely to benefit, right? And it turned out that these are countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan. Yes, their stocks, particularly Taiwan stocks, increased a lot last year. And they can substitute China to satisfy US import demand. More importantly, in the longer run, probably these countries will even take over China when the supply chain relocation starts to take place, because they have the infrastructure there. So these are the countries that we need to focus. And that's from the US side. Now from the Chinese side, China also imposed some retaliatory tariffs on the US products. Therefore, the Chinese importers tried to reduce imports from US and increase imports from other countries to substitute for US imports. It looks like EU and some emerging market economies benefit a lot, because they probably bought more equipment, machinery from Germany. They bought more soybeans from Brazil, instead of from US. So these countries will benefit because China is increasing purchase from them. So what I want to say is that the tariff may not solve the trade imbalance problem and it will hurt those countries. It won't cure the patient, and it could even undermine the doctor's reputation. Then people would ask, what are best tools? Well, I'm not in a position to advise the U.S. what the best approach to take on China. I hope the two countries could sit down, resolve the problems. But if you look at the Chinese economic growth in the past 2 decades, what are the fundamental drivers behind the Chinese economic growth? Or you can say a lot of things. Economic reform, open up, but these are too abstract. So I here did a very simple regression. After sequential deletion of statistically insignificant variables, it boils down to this form. YT is growth rate at time t. X1, X2 are respectively China's high-tech imports and inflow of foreign direct investment. They are very significant in determining China's economic growth. So I would say trade embargo, tech embargo, and the severance of cross-border trade relationship between the two countries will have a devastating impact on China. It could also hurt the US. The Silicon Valley people will be crazy, and Wall Street people won't be happy. But from a theoretical perspective, that's the result. And this chart, this table, so many numbers. This table is from Pew Research. They do surveys once a year. A survey is about countries' view of China. Do you have favorable view toward China or unfavorable view toward China? So let's take one number as example, Canada. In 2019, 67% of Canadians they have unfavorable views about China. Only 27% of them have favorable views about China. The US, 26% favorable views for China, 60% unfavorable views. So if you compare the change over this 1 year period, that's the last column. So these are the countries in the past year or so had increasingly unfavorable views about China. These countries happen to be market economies, countries of democracy, and, interestingly, China's neighboring countries, they don't like China. There are countries that become increasingly like China. But these countries are, of course, Russia. And there are also other countries, but they are a bit far away from China, like the Middle East countries, African countries, Latin American countries. So I think giving up TPP was a big mistake the US made. The US should join the TPP with other countries. And China clearly does not meet the criteria. China will be isolated. But I think in the long run, it's also good for China because it will urge China to change, to speed up its pace of economic reforms. Over so many years, the US is, nudging China to reform, but didn't work. It's time to urge China to reform. If you talk to economists in China, they do wish that policies in the US could be designed in a way that will not lead to devastating relationship between the two countries, but it will push China or bring China back to the right track in the direction of market economy reforms. So forming a TPP on the face of it, is isolating China, but I don't think that's the case in the longer run. It's good for China, for the US, and for the rest of the world. So again, don't get me wrong, I'm not advising anyone, but I think that the best solution is for both countries to cooperate. And there is a big room for cooperation. Here I want to show you the importance of Chinese purchase of US products. The first bar chart shows a very low level of China's consumption in relation to GDP, only 39%. Lower than developed countries like the US, and even lower than developing countries like India. So China needs to consume, don't just invest, consume, please. And then the second chart shows that China's consumption demand was mainly, virtually 100% satisfied by domestic producers. In other words, import content of China's consumption was very low. For obvious reasons, because China has very high tariffs, like automobile, 25% tariff. So there's a need to reduce China's trade barriers to invite imported consumer goods. Is it because the Chinese don't like imported goods? No, quite on the contrary. Chinese like imported goods. The third chart shows the household spending, Chinese tourists spending overseas. Whenever Chinese visit Western countries, on the way back, they carry a lot of bags. You name it, brand new. They go to department stores, they go to outlets, they buy whatever they can, not only for themselves, for their relatives, for their friends. So there are agents in China who travel around the world and buy products and sell it back to their compatriots back in their country with comfortable margins. So that's why you don't see baby formula in the shelves in Australia or even in Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong government had to impose a policy, maximum 2 cans each individual. And they check at the border. If you buy 3, they put you in jail. I'm not joking. It is subject, right? It is. Anyway, so why don't you just reduce tariff and let people meet their demand through less strenuous channels? Now here comes the phase 1 trade deal. In this chart, I want to study, is this trade deal feasible or not? Because it looks like China needs to increase purchase of US products by $200 billion over a period of 2 years, on top of the previous peak recorded in 2017. That sounds kind of challenging. So the last column marked in green are the numbers that are on page 64 of the trade agreement. The 4 numbers add up to exactly 200. So this is to say China needs to increase, say, the first year agriculture products purchased by $12.5 billion. And the next year, $19.5 billion additional. Total is $32 billion for the 2 years. So these are the embedded in the deal. So what I did here is I used 2017 as the base year because the deal is based on that. Then I extrapolate the demand of imports for 2020 and 2021 using the organic growth rate that was observed in the past few years. So that's not difficult. Then I calculate the needed imports, the purchases from the US in the next 2 years. Eventually, I calculate the share of imports from the US in China's total imports of relevant products. Now, the conclusion is in the last three columns, the last two columns. Basically, what it's saying here is there will be a quite significant increase in the share of U.S. imports from U.S. in the next 2 years. For example, agriculture products will have to grow from 17.7% to 28%. This will probably have to squeeze or crowd out imports from other countries like Brazil. But that's probably China, something China will have to do. Energy, from 2.9% will have to increase to 14.4%. So China will have to probably reduce imports of energy products from countries like, I don't know, Russia, Middle East, in order to buy more from the US. But it's doable. It's doable. It's not infeasible. Whether this can be done or not depends on willingness, not on feasibility. I heard recently, I read from newspapers, US government officials are saying maybe, well, due to the epidemic, China may not be able to meet the meet the demand to buy enough agricultural products. I don't know. I hope China can still fulfill the agreement. Anyway, so I think this is on trade. Now, on the long-term challenges, I think the biggest challenge faced by China longer term is slowing economic growth and rising debt, not only by government, but also by corporate and households. Economic slowdown is inevitable. What we observed in countries like Korea and Japan in the 90s and 80s is very telling. After peaking at a certain level, the economy will have to slow due to the base effect and also some structural issues. And China also has a lot of structural issues as the economy grows, and also the demographics. When you get old, you have fewer people to work, and your economy will inevitably slow. So that's okay. It's within expectation. But what is not quite within expectation is the level of debt in China, which accumulated at a very fast clip in the past decade. Say, overall debt stood at 260% of GDP currently, compared to less than 150% before the financial crisis. Well, 260%, is that too high or not so high? It depends on who you compare with. If you compare with the US, it's about the same level. But I don't think that's apple-to-apple comparison. US is a developed country. US household wealth is 6 times of US GDP. That's not the same for China. China produces a lot of GDP, doesn't produce a lot of wealth. That's amazing. But you have to compare China with countries of similar level of GDP, similar income level. So in this group, we have all emerging market economies. China turned out to be an outlier. Debt level is extremely high, 260%. Many countries, before their debt could accumulate to that level, they already collapsed. It's amazing. China hasn't collapsed. One friend just said before the forum that China didn't even have a recession. That's amazing. Yeah. I think China, yes, has not had a reported recession. That's true. Yeah. But how about debt? You can hide recession, but you cannot hide delinquency. If there's a payment that cannot be made, then it will be seen. Well, therefore, some market pessimists like Chanos said many years ago, China is on a treadmill to hell. But people say that many years. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. They probably don't know the treadmill could be very long. And China does sometimes take a break. And the key here is savings rate. Savings rate in China is extremely high. Used to be over 50%. Now already down to 46%. Still very high. So nobody knows when a country will have a financial crisis at certain savings rate. But to have an informed discussion, I look at the savings rate of various countries at the eve of their financial crisis. Like Japan, 1990, savings rate was 33%. Korea, 1980, 38%. Thailand, 33%, 97. US and UK had a lower level before they had financial crisis. But compared to these countries, China's savings rate is extremely high. Right. As long as you have very high savings rate, plus you have capital control, the money will have to stay within the country. And you have to put the money somewhere. Either you put money in the bank, or you buy apartment, or you buy stocks, or you buy bonds. Either way, you support the economy. You put it in the bank, the government will immediately take that money and lend it to corporates or roll over the previous debt that is falling due. So then some people get concerned, wait a minute, your population is aging. Usually when you have old people, they don't save. Old people are negative savers. So when you have population aging, your savings rate will fall very rapidly. Well, that's not the case in China. The irony is many countries take care of their elderly. Chinese government doesn't. You are on your own, even you are 70 or 80 years old. China's old age pension, social safety net are very underdeveloped, primitive. It's not like in Western countries. You draw down your pensions, 401ks. These things are not in existence in China. So the chart I'm showing here is Chinese population start to age from 2010. Yes, savings rate did edge down somewhat from then. However, it's quite moderate. It's still very high. So I would say, as long as China's savings rate is high, as long as China still has the capital control, I don't think Chinese financial crisis is in the immediate offing. Now, just want to remind you that what happened in Japan, that Japan's so-called demographic dividends peaked in the 80s. After that, people start to get old. And at the same time, Japanese savings rate, household savings rate, slide downward. But China is slightly different. Chinese will have to get old, but they don't necessarily save less. I guess the risk is there, the high level of debt. There's a mountain of debt, but I don't think it will melt down very soon. Now, what are the opportunities in China? Well, I think from the first chart, there are a lot of numbers. We saw investment growth down to low single digits. We saw exports negative growth last year. But consumption held up relatively well, still 8-9% growth. Particularly service-related consumptions. It is creeping up in these years. Now, one way to look at it is you look at the share of urban consumption, per capita urban consumption, because urban population spend more on services than rural population. So if urban consumption as a percentage of total consumption grows up, you will know service is now playing a big role, right? Of course, you can also use some survey data to calculate the share of service in household consumption. But point to the same conclusion. Services are playing an increasingly important role in household consumption. People travel a lot, and they also need to visit hospital. Why? Ironically, these days they have to visit hospital even more frequently than before. And they subscribe financial services. So here I want to highlight a few industries that may have long-term growth potential, despite the short-term, disruption from the virus, and also despite long-term challenges from the high level of debt. The first is financial services, which this area is a very important industry included in the Phase 1 trade agreement. The first bar chart, vertical bar chart, shows the composition of household wealth, including housing. Housing accounts for 41% of Chinese household wealth because they, like I said, they buy apartments, multiple apartments, because they think it's their savings. But the same ratio in China, in the US, is only 26%. But with the population aging, people will have to increase the liquidity of their wealth holdings. You don't want to be 80 years old and hold 10 apartments. That's so illiquid. Right? You have to invest, diversify your investment away from housing to somewhere else. Financial wealth. Now, the horizontal bar chart shows the composition of Chinese households' financial wealth. Guess what? They put a lot of money in the banking system. 51% is in the form of cash and deposits with banks. In the US and UK, they don't do that. I mean, the US households probably don't have a lot of cash. Chinese have a lot of cash. Well, they say, well, China may not follow the US or EU. China may follow Japan. The Japanese also hold a lot of cash. That's true. That's true. But another big item here is this 15.2%. That's insurance and pension. China has only 15%, way below the level seen in other countries, which is around or above 30%. So over time, China will have to diversify away from housing into insurance and old age pension. So these investments will help support the financial market because these companies taking your money, in turn, they will have to invest in the financial market. And there is another area, the market in pink, that's 22%. What is that? Now, I'm the independent director of Lufax. Lufax is the largest P2P company in China. Shadow banking. A lot of money, the Chinese household, they were lent to each other through banks or through some financial intermediaries. This is a risky part of investment, and the government is trying to clean the house. So a lot of money will have to come out from this category and go to other parts. Maybe bonds, maybe insurance, maybe stocks. So anyway, financial services tend to be a very attractive, very promising industry in China. Healthcare. I can never overemphasize the importance of healthcare in China. Even setting aside the current coronavirus, China's chronic diseases are on the rise. Diabetes, tumors. Now we have this more acute problem. So I think this epidemic in its aftermath will have to force Chinese government to sharply increase the spending on the healthcare industry. So this is an elderly care. It is projected that by the end of 2030, China will have a population of 1.4 to 1.5 billion, of which 1/4 will be over the age of 60, equivalent to the entire population in the United States. So that will be amazing. That will trigger a lot of industries, a lot of demand for related services and products. Even as of now, the sales of diapers for elderly grew by 15%. Still 15, used to be higher, now 15%. Faster than the diapers sold to babies. I have a Goldman Sachs colleague who worked in Japan. She told me in Japan, there are more pets, dogs, cats, more pets than children. I said, fine, but we sell more diapers to the elderly than to the babies. So you can see the two countries are competing who is older. Birth rate is going down. Despite the relaxing of one-child policy, people just don't, they got used to have one child. So elderly care is a promising industry. Education. You look at the preschool education. These are toddlers, but Chinese parents already send them to study mathematics, Olympic, these things. I mean, maybe it's an Asian tradition. Here in C2, right? There's some school here in C2. I saw Chinese, Koreans, Indians. They're all Koreans, Chinese, and Indians. Maybe it's an Asian tradition. The parents never spare spending on their children in this kind of after-school training or even underage training. So Chinese household already spends 350 billion yuan in 2018 for the kids, younger than 5. I don't think that's healthy, but that's the way it is. That's the way it is, unfortunately. And online education also. Online education for adults and for people who are preparing to study overseas. There's a very well-known company called New Oriental Education, which is listed in New York, NASDAQ. Look at the share price. A year ago, it was like $50. Now, by the time I made this chart, it was over 120. And I just checked the share price before I came here, 140. Amid the intense US-China trade war, that share price skyrocketed. So this is education. Tourism, well, maybe it's not the opportune time to talk about Chinese tourists now. But I don't think China's long-term potential has changed because of the epidemic. But anyway, let me just speak a few words about this. Here people are more interested in the overseas, or so-called outbound tourists. It's still growing like 15% a year. And they travel to Europe, to the US, not to mention Asian countries. And what is more interesting is that 150 million Chinese tourists traveled each year abroad. This number in absolute terms is astronomical. But in relative terms, it's small. That's only about 10% of Chinese population. You know what's the ratio for Korea? 30%. 30% Koreans travel overseas every year. China, 150 million, already big, but in relative terms, not so big. The potential is great. Potential is great. And they buy a lot of things when they go back home. One more industry, sports. I think that after the epidemic, people will spend more money on sports. It turns out this virus is attacking the unhealthy people. They are more vulnerable to this virus. If you are healthy, chances are much better for you to avoid it. And actually, spending on sports in China already increased a lot. Like I worked in Washington in the IMF for 11 years. And when I returned to China in 2004, I took the post as chief economist of CICC based in Beijing. And there's a big floor, and we have analysts, over 100 analysts. And we have traders on the same floor. I happen to have an office because I'm the chief economist. But during lunch break, when I look out through the window, people are taking a nap in their cubic, they're taking a nap. But 2 years ago, I visited my friend over there, happened to be lunchtime as well. Nobody is there. I said, where are these analysts? I was told they're in the gym. That's a big change. 15 years can change a lot. So as a result of this, China's spending on sports increased dramatically. Now already reached 1 trillion yuan. 1 trillion yuan. What's the concept of 1 trillion yuan? Well, in percent of GDP, it's just 1% of China's, 1.1% of China's GDP. You know what's the figure for the US? 3%. The room to catch up is still huge. If you look at the potential, it's huge. And now it's not surprising to see the share price developments for the two well-known sport goods producers. One is Anta, the other is Li-Ning. They are Chinese Nike and Adidas. Li-Ning price increased over the past 2 years by a factor of 4. Anta by a factor of 2.2, 2.5. All during the trade war. So yes, there are challenges in China, but opportunities are still a lot to be tapped into. Let me just conclude. I think there's no lack of headwinds in China in the short term, but I don't think the long-term prospects have been changed. Long-term potential is still there. And one big challenge faced by China is the high level of debt. But because of some unique features, desirable or undesirable, they're there. And they may weather China from an immediate meltdown, despite the high level of debt. The most thorny issue, in my view, is the changing relationship with the US. I think China in the past 40 years benefited a lot from improved relationship with the US. If that underpinning is not there, I think there's a very high risk of these two countries getting decoupled. It won't happen tomorrow, but it will likely happen over time. China will reduce reliance on US technology products, even on US dollar. China may want to invent their own digital currency to circumvent the settlement with US dollar, using US dollar. And the US will, for sure, reduce reliance on China's consumer products, even if the US still run a huge trade deficit, but the US may even prefer to run it against other countries, not China. So if that does happen, I think there will be a process of supply chain relocation, which can only be accelerated by the epidemic in China now. And relocation will, the manufacturer will relocate away from China. But will they come to the US? I'm not sure. They may go to some other countries where I think we will see greater investment opportunities, probably even better than in China. Let me just stop here. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Ha. That is, usually there's a trade-off between being broad and shallow or narrow and deep, and you gave us both broad and deep.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, luckily, I can hold off on my questions because we'll be having dinner. And so what I'll do rather is kind of jettison my own prerogative and just go straight to the audience for questions that you might have. So she did just got the mic.
Hi, my name is Shuo. I'm a second-year China Studies SIs. So you talk about that most of the provinces, the local governments are running fiscal deficit in China last year. So, but you don't touch something about the fiscal transfer, the system within the Chinese fiscal system, that some provinces such as Guangdong provinces or the city of Shanghai, they need to transfer some of their fiscal surpluses in the past year to some other provinces. So I just want to know, do you have some opinions about that kind of system, and do you think that that kind of system is going to collapse so that the central government has to change it?
I don't think that will collapse. There is a fiscal transfer mechanism in China. There are two kinds of transfer mechanism in China. One is through revenue sharing, like a VAT. A certain proportion goes to the central government with the remainder with the local government. And the other is a more so-called general transfer funds, through which the central government transfer a certain amount of money to each provinces. It is working. It is still working. But it's not perfect. I know it's not perfect because the transfer, as far as I know, maybe they have improved, but last time I checked, it was still sort of on an ad hoc basis. Not like the transfer mechanism that we saw in countries like Canada or Australia. Usually, countries like Canada and Australia, because they have natural resources concentrated in certain region of the country, so they have to form a centralized revenue sharing fund or a pool, if you like, and they transfer money. So they get money from resource-rich region and transfer to the other regions of the country. In China, same, because Shanghai is so rich, Shanghai is so poor. You do need to have this kind of a fund. And the transfer should be based on expenditure needs. This is one thing that I did in Indonesia. Indonesia is a typical country, right? I don't think China is, this transfer system is that sophisticated yet. But yes, there is a transfer mechanism. It is still working. It is working, yeah. So part of the deficit, as you see there, will be financed through the transfer. Through the transfer, and part of the deficit is financed through bond issuance. Like I said, the Chinese government, local government issue a lot of bonds, and some part of that deficit may even be financed through bank lending in a discrete way, because according to the Chinese budget law, local government cannot borrow directly from banks. But there's some gray area that local government often establish their own so-called window companies. They ask the company to borrow and to finance government spending. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Mario?
Professor Ha, thank you very much for coming and giving this presentation. One thing I wanted to ask about you is we've seen over the past year and this current year some indication of price movement within China, and especially with the African swine fever, and then looking at shortages of goods here and the effects that that has on prices domestically in China. What I wanted to ask is, do you see price stability as being a concern for the central government, or should it be? Or do you think it's something that will not be terribly affected by the virus and other current events?
The swine flu did send the pork price skyrocketing, I have to say. Last year, in some cities, price increased by like 40, 50%, right? That's why the Chinese CPI registered a 4.5% increase last year. It used to be around 2 to 3%, last year. So the hope not long ago was after pig farmers start to increase production, pork price will stabilize. But unfortunately, we have this coronavirus, and so many people are out of work now. It's not that they lost job, they still have the job, but they're not working, they're not producing. Some job you can do it at home, but certainly not manufacturing of basic consumer goods. So there could be some short-term demand for consumer goods that may not be immediately met. But overall, I think Chinese production is still strong. And in the event of export hurdles, China can even, shift more products for domestic consumption. So it's not a very big concern. The biggest concern I have, or the repercussion effect from this coronavirus are two. One is fiscal revenue. Deficit last year was as high as almost 5% compared to a budgeted projected figure was 3%. And revenue was growing 3.8% last year compared to an 8.1% increase in expenditure. Coming to this year, will China still get 3.8% revenue growth? Will expenditure increase exceed 8.1%? I think it's very likely. So fiscal difficulty is very imminent. Now, again, by summer, every year, about 6 to 7 million Chinese college students graduate. How are they going to find jobs? And we already see that many employers are thinking of laying off their workers because of this difficulty. So then every year you have to absorb these people. If you don't, they may have to wander on the streets. That's the last thing the government wants to see. So these are the two challenges.
Claudia?
Hi, my name is Claudia Trevisan. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. What do you think might be the impact on Xi Jinping's image of the profound slowdown of the economy and the coronavirus? You see any threat to the legitimacy of the party?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a tough one. I think as of now, his image is still quite good, and the anti-corruption, campaign. Look, when a country had a very fast economic growth, but in the absence of rule of law, a strong leader took over. Usually at the very beginning, his approval rating is high. Look at Putin. The oligarchs, the Russian economy grew, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, corruption, oligarchs, these things made people fed up. And Putin took over, people like him. Well, but in the longer run, then it will really depend on how you manage the country, how you manage the economy. Right? And the coronavirus is something that will definitely leave a mark. But who is ultimately responsible for this is still unknown. I watched the ambassador's interview. Ambassador was here last year. He's very good, very decent man. And recently he went on an interview. He was asked some tough questions. And Peter Navarro yesterday also faced with interviews similar questions. So we'll see how things play out. Right? If it is a natural course, then it's a natural course. If it's not, then we'll see what exactly is the reason behind the problem. So, but China, if I read from the Chinese newspaper because I lived here for so many months, I didn't talk directly with the people in Beijing, but I read from the Chinese media, the Chinese president is trying to advocate a resumption of production as soon as possible. And many investment banks, my former colleagues, they track the traffic flows in the aftermath of the long Chinese New Year holiday. And I couldn't put the chart here because I saw the charts later. It was very interesting. In the past few years, usually 7 days after the New Year holiday, travel becomes very hectic. Travel flows pick up. But now the travel flow is still flat. In Shanghai, in Beijing, it's just flat. So despite the fact that the president is urging people to come back to work, many people has not, they still are hesitating to do it. And my former employer, CICC, even made a survey to 26 provinces in China. They sent survey questionnaires there. And the result shows that only around 25% of the Chinese corporates start to resume to work, business as usual. With the remainders are either still idling or working only part-time. So I think the biggest challenge, even after this coronavirus, for the government and for the Chinese leadership is still the economy. And that's going to be tough.
We have time for one more very quick question. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Hall, for your excellent speech, and thank you, Professor Mercer, for picking me. And my question is also about the coronavirus outbreak. Do you see any positive effects of this times break in terms of economy for this coronavirus outbreak?
The producer of face masks, definitely. That's for sure. And in the aftermath, I think, like I said, the healthcare industry will receive a lot of spending, both from the government and households. Sports also. Right? And if, related to that question, if President Xi would like to sort of relieve a little bit of the brake on housing, I think people will buy apartments. They want to upgrade. They want to live in a more spacious apartment. They even want to live in townhouses or independent single-family homes if they can afford it. Because it's been reported, if you live in an apartment with hundreds of families, chances are you're gonna get infected. It's you know, it's the reality. Yeah. So housing, if policy allows, could receive big inflows, and that will, you know, for people who already own apartments, that's going to be a very good news.
So on that positive note, what I would like to say is that Zhao Jian has been up for 3 days straight preparing and cooking for the reception. So what I'd like to do is we will have a reception after this, but first I'd like all of us to really thank Professor Ha for what is really a wonderful presentation.